So Rock and Roll Racing actually is sort of the spiritual sequel to a game we made called RPM Racing. In RPM Racing, we didn't fully understand the trade-offs between high-res mode and the standard mode. You might naturally think high-res is better because you have more pixels on the screen. The problem with that was back in those days, for memory efficiency, the way you made games was you drew a cell and then replicated that cell as many times as you wanted to build a level or build a scene out of a background of cells. And that was a very efficient way, memory efficient way. Now, if you used high-res cells, you had many fewer cells to work with. So later on, we sort of joked that RPM Racing was high-res grass. And we learned from that lesson when we pivoted after RPM Racing to Rock and Roll Racing that standard mode let us get so many more cells, and that, in fact, let us make more varied levels. And that was kind of the early beginnings of how we define the look of Rock and Roll Racing.
Lights them up!
So we're trying to come up with ideas for what to make Rock and Roll Racing better than RPM Racing, because all of us played RPM Racing and it was just slow and it wasn't fun. You kept running into the sides of the track. There was all kinds of things that were going on that were just not really good. So when we started talking about Rock and Roll Racing, we started talking about making the tracks bigger, about putting weapons on the cars, about doing all these things to make it actually a fun game.
We pulled the camera back a little bit. I also sped up the cars. I literally made them travel faster. Making the cars faster and making the track bigger to accommodate that speed helped a lot. It was actually quite technically challenging to get that done, though, because the game was not designed originally to have bigger tracks. That was probably the toughest technical challenge outside of just trying to cram a big game into a small cartridge. I think it was only 128K that you could even have for the entire game. Everything, code, data, everything.
What he had to do was figure out how to take each system that was the game was running and squeeze down the amount of time that they took so that he could get the same amount of action into fewer video frames. Some systems ran every single frame every 60th of a second, and other systems would only run once every 3 frames in order to make it all work together. And he would go literally line by line fixing things, both to make the game smaller so it would fit in the 8 megabit cartridge and run faster to be able to squeeze all the systems in.
In terms of the gameplay, we loved the racing component of RPM Racing, but Rock and Roll looks so much better. And then, you add missiles and mines and smoke fields and oil spray, and now you've really got something fun in terms of the racing and in terms of the combat element to it. So it just came together and felt and played amazing.
I think the appeal of Rock and Roll Racing is just racing games are always fun. And if you can blow things up while you're racing, it's even funner. Because there's a certain thing about being able to get in front of your friend while you're racing and then hit him with a rocket from behind or hit him with an oil slick to where he spins out. Or not only testing your racing skills, but you're testing your skills to be able to fight while you're racing.
When you're building a game, if the game just plays the same every single time, you pretty rapidly get bored with it. And this is in the days before the internet existed and people could patch games. So we had to make a game that was self-sufficient and would last for long periods of time, that people would play and play and play and play. And so some of those elements are just adding upgrades to the game. It just seems natural, like if you've got a car, you just want to make it better and better over time so you get rewarded for your playing. One of the challenges is that you really have to balance it carefully. And again, a lot of credit goes to Bob for solving these problems. Because if you're in the lead and you have a lot of weapons to use against your opponent, then the opponent will never catch up. And so most of the weapons are pretty weak if you're the lead racer. Like oil slicks don't do that much against you, and mines don't do that much. Whereas the missiles are actually quite powerful because it's fired by the person who's in the back. But you can't make it too powerful because then the trick is get behind somebody, shoot them, and then win the race.
So one of the innovations of Rock and Roll Racing was putting real rock and roll music into the game. And the person who gets credit for that is actually Brian Fargo, including the name Rock and Roll Racing. It was like one of those ideas that just seemed so obvious when you hear about it. You think to yourself, why hasn't someone else already done this? Why isn't everybody doing this? The first company we contacted, or the first musician we contacted, was actually ZZ Top. We thought, hey, maybe we'll call this ZZ Top's Racing or ZZ Top's Rock and Roll Racing. The amount of money, the price tag, basically, for us to be able to get them was prohibitive. It was too expensive. So we thought, okay, that's the issue. That's why no one is doing this, because it just costs too much. And then we contacted a music service that provides sort of low-cost licensed music in public settings, elevators, and things like that. And when we looked through their library, we found there were a ton of cool songs in there. And so we licensed, I think, about a half a dozen songs at a reasonable price, and we were able to adapt them into the hardware at the time. And it was like peanut butter and chocolate. It was just perfect.
You could always make the cars go faster or paint them red, because red is always the fastest color. But I think it was the addition of heavy metal that made everyone just drive a little bit more frantically, and it upped the game a little bit. My favorite track on Rock and Roll Racing would probably be Highway Star.
What songs did we know that that made you want to go out and drive? You know, and I had brought up the song Highway Star. I said to the guys, I go, here's the song that I would put, here's the song I would use. And they had never heard of it, so I played it for them. That one got in, and then Radar Love got in, and a couple others that were on, and then it was all about being able to license them. And back then, it wasn't like today where, because of Guitar Hero and all the rock and roll games, it's very difficult to get a license that's going to cost more than what your game is.
We, as developers, even way back then, had a tremendous passion for music ourselves. I mean, I remember one afternoon we were at the office and we just happened to hear a radio ad on the commercial for a concert that was going to be going on that night, and tickets were still available. We literally got in the car, drove down the road to the venue, bought tickets, and went to the concert.
I can still hear that song playing in my head, and I can hear Larry Huffman with "The stage is set, the green flag drops."
The stage is set, the green flag drops.
The idea of putting voice in there, like a race caller's voice into the game, that was another one of those ideas, just like putting rock and roll music into the game, that when we thought about it, seemed really obvious. Why aren't more people doing this? And again, we thought there must be some sort of technological reason for it. But as we explored it, we realized we could get great compression rates, and we could replay that audio, the voice tracks, at high fidelity, and then it would sound great.
Let the carnage begin!
And I think it was Brian Fargo in Interplay that managed to do it, was get Larry Huffman to come and do the actual calling of the races.
Part of how I knew who he was, and maybe even why we ended up getting him, was there used to be this local racing competition, something Speedway, I don't remember exactly, but that's how I knew him, was from the radio. So I would hear it a lot on the radio, and if I were going to imitate him, I'd have to do not something from Rock and Roll Racing, but what I used to hear all the time, which was, "Sunday, Sunday, Sunday."
Cat, light them up!
He loved profanity, and so there were a lot of comments we couldn't even use that were hilarious, but you know, it's like, nope, Nintendo is definitely not going to approve that one. All right, well, let's move on to the next one. But there wasn't a whole lot of space on the cartridge for things like audio clips, and so we really had to pick and choose the ones we could get on there and make sure that they were compressed so that they didn't take much space. So that was one challenge. And then the second one was just to make sure that they were played at the right time in the race so that it made sense in accordance with the action that was going on, and also not to be too repetitive.
And it worked beautifully. One of the innovations that really makes rock and roll racing feel like rock and roll racing was Larry's voice.
Rip was lost out there. Holy Toledo!
I had a whole bunch of clips that they had given me, and all I needed to do was find trigger points, what I called trigger points, where if something happened in the game and I wanted to highlight it, then I would just call one of the little clips, and I would either pick them randomly or have one associated with a particular action. Like if somebody blew up somebody else and I could detect that the missile was shot from a long way away, then maybe I could know, oh, that was probably a really good shot. That was shot from way over here, it hit way over there. So I'll play a special clip right here like, oh, look at that shot or something, some of the things that he said. So it was just find proper moments. When are things where you as a player would want to hear something, and we would know those by playing the game. I'd play the game tons. In fact, that's how I knew Rock and Roll Racing was going to be a big hit, was in any game, I do this with all the games, if you spend all day long working on the game, and then before you go home, what you want to do instead of going home is play the game some, you know you're working on a hit. And any time that a moment would go by where I'd think, oh, there should have been something there, I would just go back to the code and change it and put something there. And over time, you stop saying to yourself, oh, I wish there were something there, because now you've got them all, and now you've got your game.
In Rock and Roll Racing, we brought a lot of the Blizzard humor into it. It was still in its early stages, but we were having fun with our games. Like in the backgrounds, there's a sign for Viking Cola. There was also Olaf from Lost Vikings. He was one of the secret characters in Rock and Roll Racing that you can play. And we were just having fun with these games. Whenever, we pushed it from a normal racing game on boring dirt tracks to racing in outer space, right? To racing on inferno planets with aliens, blasting away at you. And that was just the sort of birth of what Blizzard did with all of the games. What we did to fantasy and sci-fi and horror was all started back in those little games that took a year to make, and we were just kind of having fun with it. We didn't look at it as we were trying to be radically different. We were saying, hey, we can do whatever we want, let's do it. And I think that set the tone for future Blizzard games.